Good morning from Washington, D.C. This is Khalid Jahshan at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Welcome to this webinar focused today on Syria's transitional government, challenges, prospects, and global implications. As all of you know, on January 29, 2025, Ahmad al-Shara was named president of Syria for a transitional period, and the country's constitution was suspended. 7 weeks after leading Hayat al-Sham in an offensive that overthrew Bashar al-Assad's presidency, to be exact, on December 8, 2024, al-Shara was also authorized to form a temporary legislative council to govern the country until a new constitution is adopted. But after 14 years of civil war, Syria is severely fractured, and its economy and infrastructure have been destroyed over the period of civil war. With 90% of Syrians living under poverty line, over 600,000 killed, more than 14 million people displaced between internally and out of the country, including about 6.7 to 7 million refugees who now face increasing hostilities in the host countries where they sought refuge. While Syria's new president laid out ambitious goals to rebuild state institutions and develop the economy, he has said that it may take up to 4 years to write up a new constitution and hold formal election, raising concerns among observers in Syria and out of Syria about prolonged uncertainty over governance, the rebuilding process, the future of the Syrian people. Arab Center Washington, D.C. is convening this panel today, a panel of distinguished experts to discuss the myriad challenges facing Syria in this transitional period, assess the prospects of success in instituting a democratic and inclusive government, explore the impact of regional and global dynamics, and offer policy recommendations for both Syria and outside powers who are basically have declared that they have interest in the outcome in Syria. So we have many, many questions to discuss today, and there a division of labor has been worked out among the participants in this panel. But the main questions that we will be focusing on, or our panelists will be focusing on, deal with questions that we get quite frequently at Arab Center from our followers and scholars, academics, media people, community members, activists, human rights groups, questions that are very frequently asked about Syria. For example, how will the new government, in the process of rebuilding the country, ensure fair representation and protection of the rights of all Syrians? 2, how inclusive will the temporary governing council and constitutional drafting committees, or the constitution writing process, all of it, how inclusive will that be? How will President al-Shara and other HTS government appointees, colleagues of his, reconcile their Islamist roots with the rights of Syria's diverse ethnic, socio-political, and religious, as I said, diversity? How can democratic institutions be built to prevent a return to authoritarian rule, which happens quite often in post-revolutionary societies that undergo change like Syria has just experienced? How will the new government manage state records? You know, we keep talking about accountability, abuse of human rights. Are the records being kept? We have seen some really vicious records revealed recently. And who's in charge of them? Where are they being stored? Are they safe? How will the new government address other groups, including particularly armed groups, and specifically, for example, the autonomous Kurdish forces, and prevent, if you will, renewed conflict in the country? How will the new government deal with external interventions? I mean, you know, yes, Iran is out, Russia is out, but they're not totally invisible in what's happening in Syria. And so is, of course, the West trying to also, in addition to regional powers, so Turkey, Russia, Iran, and we shouldn't forget Israel in terms of trying to influence the outcome in the country. And finally, how will the US and European countries who have maintained serious sanctions on Syria and designated HTS as a terrorist group deal with the new government? As a matter of fact, it's in the news this morning where some decisions have been made by the UK and the EU to try to ease some of these sanctions. So we will be talking about that in the program. So as I said, I will introduce the speakers. We have four speakers, great speakers today with many years of experience in Syrian affairs, and particularly in the change that has taken place in Syria. I'll introduce them briefly. Their bios are on the web. I'm sure you have seen them there, and they're all four of them are very well-known scholars and activists. We'll begin today with Dima Musa, who is a Syrian-American lawyer and member of the Syrian National Coalition. She will be followed by Brahim Al-Asil, who's a senior fellow at Middle East Institute. Rahaf Ad-Dughli will follow. She's a lecturer in Middle East and North African Studies at Lancaster University. And last but not least, our friend Dr. Joshua Landis will conclude, if you will, the panel. He's chair and professor in Middle East Studies and co-director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. So thanks to all four of them. Each one will have 10 to 12 minutes. I'll signal, give you a 2-minute warning toward the end of your 10-minute kind of presentation, but up to 12 minutes. That will leave us about 30 minutes for the art of conversation with our audience. We have a couple of hundred people who have joined us, international audience as always, US, Europe, Middle East, and so on. And we will basically accept your questions. Please make your questions short and direct them to specific participant or panelists. And I will be more than delighted to read your question and convey it to the specific person you are directing it to. We hope to end the program on time at 11:30. So with that said, Dima, the floor is yours. Dima will be focusing on rebuilding state institutions, some of these questions that I just spoke about. Particularly, I hope she will brief us a bit on the constitution drafting process and prospects, particularly for upcoming elections in Syria. Dima is in Syria. You could tell the weather is cold and there's no electricity. So stay warm, everybody. Dima, the microphone is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Khalil, and thanks to the Arab Center in Washington for this opportunity, especially with the distinguished guests. As Khalil mentioned, I am in Syria, so I'm not coming to you from the North Pole. It's cold. There's no electricity. I get electricity about, at best, 4 hours a day. So I'm glad I have this opportunity to be with you. I made sure I charge all my devices. As Khalil mentioned, I'm a member, or maybe I should say I was a member of the Syrian National Coalition, because we are working on dissolving and restructuring within the new reality, of course. And this applies probably to all political bodies formed within the revolutionary sort of framework. As such, I had been a member of the opposition in exile, but I arrived in Damascus about 2 weeks after the regime's flight on December 8th. And my main observation so far is how dire the living conditions are in Syria, something we have heard about a lot and followed very closely for over 10 years. But seeing and experiencing it is a whole different story. It's almost unbelievable how much poverty there is in every corner of the country. This is, of course, mainly the result of the corruption that was rampant in Syria, reaching unimaginable levels over the last few years by people's own experiences. Everybody is talking about how in the last 3 to 4 years, basically Asma al-Assad has put her hands on almost everything. Anything you buy, there is an additional tax, and that was directly linked to Asma al-Assad. And ordinary Syrians knew this. And this has affected every aspect of life, contributed to the impoverishment of Syrians, like Khalil said, over pushing 90% of the population under the poverty line. This was and continues to be exacerbated by Western and particularly US sanctions. The bad legacy of the Assad regime, which destroyed the country and its people, ruined a huge part of the infrastructure, exhausted the economy, and corrupted the state apparatus almost in every part of it. Above all, the policies that the regime implemented over the last 20 years, not, and more so over the last probably 10 or 5 years, especially in terms of lifting subsidies, privatization, systematic destruction of the state sector, and all productive sectors has contributed to all of this. So this has left the state and all its institutions paralyzed and nearly non-functional. Some have resumed to work, and I have had an experience with that, like the civil registry or certain parts of it, but not all. And most concerning today is probably the judiciary. There, it hasn't resumed its work, and there are some concerns about that, especially from people who are working on issues relating to detainees and missing persons, because there's still no way, the government is not dealing in a very professional way with the issue of preserving evidence, and this has been very concerning. So part of that is related that the judiciary is almost nearly stopped. Vast areas are completely destroyed and reduced to rubble, which has implications on return of refugees and displaced people. So the current leadership basically has inherited a state in ruins at best, literally and figuratively. State institutions do need to get back to work, but at the same time need a lot of work to be functioning at the minimum required to serve the citizens, which requires resources that the state doesn't have. And certainly, like I mentioned, sanctions remain a huge obstacle in the way of improving the situation. People are frustrated and think that the caretaker government has not been fully effective, which is understandable due to the issue of lack of resources. And we need to always remember that we just passed the 2-month mark, which is by all measures a short time when talking about not only 14 years of destruction, but really over half a century of plundering Syria's resources. And with it, the brain drain that happened over these last 50 years, and particularly over the last 14 years. This is a major factor as well. I also believe applying the Idlib model as it is cannot be effective for the whole country. And I think the caretaker government has not yet completely come out of that mentality. So we will see what happens on March 1st, the deadline that was set for the caretaker government. And the expectation is that there will be changes. Until a few days ago, people weren't sure. There were expectations that it might be extended. But I believe the foreign minister, Al-Shaybani, has indicated that on March 1st, there will be changes. So everybody is waiting, and people are mainly looking to see a more diverse government with a focus on technocrats instead of the current group, which was basically the salvation government that was brought and put in Damascus. Yesterday also, the presidency announced a preparatory committee for the National Dialogue Conference, which is still not clear when that will happen. This step was perceived positively overall as indicating there is work starting on the next phase, including the constitution and leading to elections. Everybody is watching to see who would be invited to the conference. Until now, there are no clear indications who will be invited and in what capacity. And the reason I say that is because there has been talk before that there's still ambiguity regarding participation of political forces and parties. There was talk that people will be invited as individuals, not as representatives of political parties or political forces. And the focus has been on reaching out to religious, sectarian, and tribal leaders. This has raised concerns for some, and rightfully so, as political representation is more cross-cutting and inclusive, not to undermine the importance, of course, of representation of groups based on the other affiliations. And in this regard, I was actually one of the people in the big group. I don't know if you saw the picture of the previous opposition, the Syrian National Coalition and Syrian Negotiation Commission meeting with Mr. Al-Shara in the People's Palace. And of course, the picture looked like it's all men, but I was actually in there. And in the discussion, there seems to be openness towards all the experiences. And what we had offered also is that we have worked on a lot of files over the last 10 years within the opposition, especially within the constitutional process. We did a lot of work on constitution writing, on dialogue with various Syrians to prepare for a potentially, if the regime had engaged, on working on the constitution, and also on a lot of the elections laws. So of course, these things we said they belong to the Syrian people, and we are ready to hand them over to whoever is going to be working on the constitution in the future. Now, on the other issue that I think you also referred to, Khalil, is Syria is still not unified. And this is also a big concern in terms of carrying out a national dialogue with parts of the country not within one, not unified. The Northeast is still out of the equation. There are pockets in the South, while formally linked with Damascus, there's still some uncertainties about them, and there remains some tensions between them and Damascus. So inclusivity is probably one of the most important issues on the table today. And if it's not carefully and diligently worked on, especially at the national conference stage, it can set up for failure and recurrence of many problems in the future. Like I said, the leadership rhetoric thus far has been positive and continues to send comforting messages. And when looking closely, of course, we are still looking for more tangible steps in this regard. But when looking closely, there have been some positive steps that are getting lost amid the hardships of the living conditions and some incidents in some of the more sensitive areas that have historically had sectarian tensions, which were amplified during the last 14 years. We should not, however, undermine the fact that in that respect, the situation is much better than what any of us expected, starting with the fast military operation that advanced from Idlib all the way to Damascus in 11 days, and there were negligible to no civilian casualties. And this should not be undermined at all. And while security conditions, the situation remains an issue in several parts, the overall situation is acceptable. As somebody who's living here and, getting around and walking around Damascus and Homs. I had a chance to go to Homs too, which is one of the hot spots. I'm going to jump right away into something like a combination of recommendations and challenges. I think one of the main challenges is a transition from the Idlib model. It is understandable to rely on what has been tested and what has worked, quote unquote, but clearly that cannot be applied countrywide, and something needs to be worked on to improve this, to develop a model that is best for Syria as a whole. So this requires also expanding the circle of trust for Mr. Al-Shara, which we are starting to see some signs of. Inclusivity that might clash, this is one issue, that inclusivity might clash with some of the main principles on which the HTS and Idlib models were based, but also from the talk or the rhetoric or the statements coming from the government, they seem to be becoming more open. So this needs also to be demonstrated and illustrated by seeing actual inclusivity. The main priority futile to almost talk about anything. The international community, I do have a recommendation. I cannot stress it enough. Lift the sanctions. I can't stress this enough. Sectorial ones, especially, of course, we're not talking about the individuals. This continues the main obstacle before Syria's economy and has catastrophic effects on the people and their livelihood. And it also can encourage investment, especially Syrian capital, domestic and from the diaspora, and the return of much needed experiences from abroad. Also, the government needs to give a great amount of attention and prioritize the economic situation and can start with domestic resources, particularly in trying to breathe some life into the productive sector as much as possible within the current reality. This improving the economy even minimally can have positive effects on all other issues that require attention, including security, arms control, and civil peace. And the last 2 points I have are regarding inclusivity, the current, because this has implications on the dialogue conference, National Dialogue Conference, and constitution writing, and later on the elections. They should take, the current leadership should start taking tangible steps towards real inclusivity, especially of Syrians in Syria at the political level, but also those whose experiences are the main capital for rebuilding Syria. And this is not just based on representation of different social groups, geography, religion, sect, all of this, but also political forces, which ensures a more cross-cutting representation, especially socioeconomic groups. That being said, there needs to be a focus on inclusion of women and the youth, young people, because they have gained a lot of much needed experiences over the last 14 years as a direct result of the war and the crisis. Economic experiences and in various matters that feed directly into governance and constitution writing, which are the cornerstones for everything in the future. I'll stop right here.
Thank you, Dima. Right on time. Appreciate it. And I'm delighted you mentioned the issue also of the sanctions. As I mentioned earlier before we started the program, there seems to be some development, at least on the EU side this morning. I don't know how serious they are, but an announcement was made this morning by the UK that it's working with other EU partners to essentially ease some of the sanctions that have been debilitating on the Syrian economy. All right, next basically is let's go ahead and move to Brahim. Brahim, as I said, is Senior Fellow at Middle East Institute, and he will be focusing more on the regional dynamics and security, the new landscape in Syria, and particularly also the issue, or specifically the issue of economic development and reconstruction. Brahim, the floor
Very
is
much. Thanks, Khalil. Thanks for having me, and Tamara for organizing. I'll try to build on some of the great points that Dima just shared with us, also to show how complex the regional situation is. So with all the complexity that Dima just shared with us from Syria, it's also important to remember that what happens in Syria is not only shaped by Syrians, because Syria is in a very unstable region. And because of the geographic location of Syria, it's very important for many of its neighbors. And currently, it's to a certain level fragmented, it's poor, it's weak, and which means it's still open for many regional and the global players to try probably to shape the outcome in one way or the other. So let me try to paint a map or to draw a big picture to frame the regional security and what we're talking about. The fall of the Assad regime on December 8th of last year was a major geopolitical shift, probably we haven't seen for more than 2 decades since the invasion of Iraq. If we look at the country and we see a regime change that really changed the network or the alliances that regime made before. And if we look at Syria and its history, Syria was always geopolitically a balancing power. It wasn't a friendly neighbor for many of its neighbors, but it was a strong one. Everyone wanted to be able to have some sort of relationships of Syria or to keep it at least at bay. Today, it's at a crossroads with many of its neighbors have or see different opportunities and concerns inside Syria. We've seen a pragmatic approach from the current authority in Damascus, which signals that they are interested in being reintegrated in a regional order over being part of some rigid alliances, the way it was under the former regime of Assad. If we look quickly at some of the major players in the region, and probably we could start with Iran, which is facing a major setback when we talk about Syria. Of course, there is a shift from Assad's full alignment with Tehran to a more challenging government in Syria. However, it's still not very clear how much the current authority wants to push against Iran, or if it will keep. I know that might be surprising, but we might actually reach a level where the authority in Damascus wide to keep some level of engagement to avoid confrontation. For Iran, I would conclude with this point: Iran won't retreat easily. There are still some openings for Iran to go back to Syria, especially if the current authority can't unify Syria and can't generate legitimacy across the board from the Kurds to the Druze to the Alawites inside Syria. To the major neighbor Turkey, Syria has, which is Turkey. It has the largest borders, over 700 kilometers in Syria, and President Erdogan clearly sees both risks and opportunities in Syria. The key concerns are the Kurds and the Kurdish issue in Syria, which became over the last few years the priority for the Turkish agenda inside Syria. And that, of course, also complicates the ongoing negotiations between Damascus and the Syrian Democratic Forces led by General Mazloum Abdi, because the negotiations are not only happening between Damascus and the Kurds. There is also a third actor, a very influential one, Turkey, and Damascus needs to balance with both the Kurds and the Turks to have a sustainable outcome that actually meets some of the Kurdish concerns in Syria, the just concerns in Syria, but also meets or answers some of the concerns of the national security by Turkey, since it's a very powerful country. We've heard that Turkey is interested in having some military bases inside Syria. I think if those bases are, I think they will be a concern for other neighbors. We're going to talk about Saudi Arabia and Israel, and specifically the closer we get to central Syria. So if it's in the north, it's a different part of the equation. If we reach, as we heard, some parts of a central province of Hama, that changes the geopolitical balance inside Syria, and it would definitely make Arab and Israel more concerned about what happens in Syria. Let's move to the Arab neighbors. So Syria has borders with Jordan, which was very concerned about the smuggling of the Captagon by the Assad regime and its allies into Jordan and then into the Gulf. That now stopped. And that's a positive outcome for Jordan. However, also Jordan has concerns when it comes to terrorism and jihadists, and that's why there has been talks between Amman and Damascus on that, and the Jordanians are still watching how things are evolving in Syria, and especially with vis-a-vis some of the foreign fighters who fought along Al-Shara and HTS. But beyond Jordan, that's where the Arab depth comes, and that's where the major player among the Arabs, Saudi Arabia. We've seen positive signals from Saudi Arabia, and clearly Riyadh is interested in being the new gateway for Syria and to play that role. And it has, of course, to answer your point, Khalil, on economic reconstruction, Saudi Arabia is a major player in that. And also to link it to Dima's point on sanctions, Saudi Arabia could play a major role in pushing Western partners and the United States to lift sanctions when they hear that their partners in the region are trusting the new authority. That definitely would encourage global powers in the West and specifically the United States to go in that direction. A major question remains if Saudi Arabia would condition that support, or what conditions it would put on Damascus. I'll go to the point on Iran. Of course, Saudi Arabia is interested in making sure that Iran does not go back to Syria, but this is not a security concern, or it's not only a concern could be met with security measures, because if Syria is not unified, and if actually, because, you know, many analysts, when we talk about Iran, they say, oh, they might actually find a foothold if the Alawites are not happy. But not only on the coast, Iran might find a way to go back into Syria, the northeast also, if there is no consensus or there is no outcome that meets the Kurdish demands, Iran might actually try to find some actors in the northeast that they are willing to get support from it or get closer to it. On the Gulf, we talked about Saudi Arabia. There are also other players, the UAE and Qatar. Qatar was very open to the new authority in Damascus. The first leaders to visit Damascus came from Doha. The first official visit was the Emir of Qatar. Qatar supported the Syrian opposition from the beginning, and it was one or probably the only power among the Arab powers that insisted on supporting the opposition and not to accept Assad back to the Arab fold. And they bet, and they won that bet. However, I think the role of Qatar in Syria will be limited based on the role Saudi Arabia would want to play. This intra-Gulf dynamics will be visible in Syria, but also it seems like the region, or at least these actors, are at a point of a maturity where they see that it's better to actually coordinate and cooperate rather than to compete, because also of how much delicate and sensitive this experiment we're watching in Damascus is. The UAE is the most cautious one among the Arab states. It was very hesitant to open up for Damascus. It opened up a little bit, but we can still see that there is tension with the relationship. The UAE is still watching where things are going before I would say we see any major step, which might not happen at all. The UAE might step back, allow other Arab partners to work with Damascus. But I would be skeptical if Abu Dhabi plays a huge role in the short term inside Syria. I would conclude with the regional players, with Israel, and then a couple of points on global powers. I still have 2 minutes. For Israel, we see that the main concern is security. After the fall of the regime, Israel conducted some of the most massive airstrikes on one day on military depots across Syria. The justification from Tel Aviv was that we don't know who's going to come next, so we want to make sure they don't have any strategic abilities. So they destroyed any capabilities the Syrian Arab army had, which almost like ended the chapter of the Syrian Arab army. Now Syrians talk about the Syrian army, which is a totally new institution that's still in its very early stages inside Syria. Israel occupied beyond the Golan Heights, the occupied Golan Heights. They occupied the buffer zone and they went further into Syria. I think that would remain until they see what Damascus and what kind of rhetoric will come out of Damascus, and they would ask for time before they change their policy. And I would add that also Washington, D.C. is listening to Tel Aviv and their concerns for Syria. So also the sanctions, they're listening to Saudi Arabia, they're listening to other Gulf countries, to Turkey to a certain extent, and absolutely to Israel. Finally, quick point on the US and Russia as global powers. Russia faced also a setback in Syria. It's still one, in addition to Israel, Turkey, and the United States. It has actually military bases in Syria, a naval one and an aerial one. And the future of those bases is not clear because al-Sharia wants to be seen pragmatic. Also, he wants a leverage for the relationship with the United States, maybe at some point to offer clear concessions when it comes to the relationship with the Russians, or maybe he still wants to keep Syria as a balancer and make sure it doesn't go one way or the other in terms of great powers. And finally, the United States, it's not currently beyond supporting the SDF passively. It's not playing an active role. And I'll conclude with the same point as Dima did, that sanctions is probably the most important factor in everything we talked about. Because if sanctions are not lifted, most likely this experiment, this very sensitive experiment, won't succeed inside Syria, and Syria most likely will go back one way or the other to become a battleground among regional players instead of becoming an area where it's further or it's strengthening some new regional balance and order. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Appreciate that. Let's go ahead now and move to our next participant, Rahaf Dugli, who's a lecturer in Middle East and North African Studies at Lancaster University, and she will be helping us with the issues of the challenges with regards to reforming, particularly the security sector and the army, implementing disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, and so on. Rahaf, the microphone is yours.
Well, thank you very much for having me today, and thanks for the great speakers before me, Ibrahim and Dima. I think mine is the most kind of boring and dull. I was in Syria, however, but like there is the funny part coming from doing interviews with central commanders. I have been doing that for the last 3 years at least. I was on the borders. I've conducted more than 100 hours of interviews with fighters in SNA groups in particular. That was my focus. Now, when I'm gonna share with you like just for 1 minute explaining my emotions after interviewing central commanders in Damascus in the last before I return on the 2nd of February. Now, there is mixed emotions. Central commanders before the formal integrations announced in the victory speech by Mr. El-Shara. Central commanders from SNA groups, when I met them, and it's funny enough, like I met them in old Damascus, listening to Fairuz songs, and they showed me great apprehensions, concerns, uncertainty, and lack of trust. And then the next day, the victory speech, although like they told me like we are gonna join. And then when you get out of the restaurant and I'm sharing with you my personal kind of feelings at that minute after doing all these interviews with SNA commanders. I felt for 1 minute that walking in the streets is not safe at all. Like I felt like the country is gonna explode at 1 minute because of the entrenched concerns coming from SNA commanders. Now, when you are meeting back then with HTS commanders or from the new leadership, you get a totally complete different feeling. The country is gonna, there was a feeling of optimism. There was a feeling like the army will be built in like that. In a second, Syria is gonna kind of reign with sweets. And so you get two different, and I was really kind of after the victory speech and I following up with the interviews with the central commanders from all groups saying, you have now joined. This is really a new Syrian army. Now, still, I think the moment of the Assad fall has given all Syrians hope. However, we need now to look at kind of tiny things that brings, if there is about to have a new Syrian army or a unified national army. I'm gonna follow back from Dima and Ibrahim and what they've like. It's a very important issue that sovereignty is still fractured in Syria. So when we apply that on the military landscape or the complex military landscape in Syria, we see that SDF and the southern factions are not part of rebuilding, or at least the ambitious plan of the Ministry of Defense to rebuild the Syrian army. I think I'm gonna say, like, from rivalry to unity, or old foes and new alliances, and it's the challenge or the fight to build Syria's national army. Actually, as I have just said, I mean, the story of Syria's revolution is a multifaceted one. It's the story of a people subjected to killing, displacement, and exile, of armed conflict, not only between the regime and various factions, but also among the factions themselves. So, and of a fragmented geography and compromised sovereignty. Now, the South remains under the influence of Ahmad al-Aoudi factions backed by Russia and we can say UAE, while the US supported SDF holds its ground in the northeast. And we saw the deterrence of aggression operation led by HTS and several SNA factions finally brought the Assad regime to its knees. Now, however, the question now, will the new leadership be able to unify the Syrian army? I think, in my opinion, and after doing this research, we need to address not only the main challenges at the macro level, but at the micro level. Now, actually, the transition from fragmented armed faction to a unified national army under Ahmad al-Sharia is fraught with complexity. I need to mention here that while the integration of major factions began, we saw it in the victory speech 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago. I think the integration between SNA and HTS began like 2 to 3 years ago before Assad's fall, which was driven by strategic co-optation and mediation. The process, however, remained fragile and rife with challenges. Now, of course, at the heart of this challenge lies the diverse and often conflicting motivations of fighters, shaped by tribal loyalties, material incentives, and ideological convictions, which would complicate efforts to create a cohesive and unified force. Now, the Ministry of Defense's strategy to centralize military power has so far favored loyalty over competence, which raised concerns about the long-term cohesion. Moreover, external factors, following on Ibrahim and what he has said, external factors including Turkey's ambiguous rule, I would say, in terms of what will happen with SDF, and the exclusion of key factions such as SDF, also would kind of fracture that ambitious project to build a unified national army. Now, without addressing personal grievances, ensuring transparent governance, and balancing local autonomy with national cohesion, I think Syria's newly formed national army risks becoming another fragile coalition. I think the transition will ultimately depend on whether it can build trust, provide meaningful representation, and avoid the pitfalls of factionalism that have plagued the country for over a decade. Now, in terms of like, I will say it in quite like very shortly and briefly. Some of the cohesion or the integration that happened before even the latest offensive takes three major SNA armed groups, such as the Levant Front, Al-Jabha Al-Shamiyya, Suqur al-Sham. We saw defections from these two major SNA factions into HTS even before the latest offensive, which kind of paved the role for that kind of smooth integration. So HTS was planning to infiltrate the military landscape in northern Syria through securing some defections from SNA into HTS, which kind of contributed to the latest offensive. Now, however, even with the latest appointments that we saw we see more of a loyalty-based appointments. So most of these major SNA factions, the central commanders got a position within the new army. However, I think from my interviews and from the rhetoric from the military of defense, we still see lack of consideration of the micro level motivations, and it's more of versus top-down appointments. Now, I will come to that in a minute, but before that, we saw also in the new appointments few foreign commanders, which kind of also is gonna complicate the regional dynamics. Now, for example, we see Al-Khatib, the one who is the commander for the Republic Al-Haras Al-Jamhuri, who is Jordanian and wanted by Jordan, and I think that will make more of a regional complications in terms of the relationship with Jordan. And also another commander appointed and who is from a Turkish national, who is appointed in the by the Ministry of Defense. So we have that kind of, we need to resolve the foreign aspects. Now, another thing that in terms of the micro level motivations, as I said, despite the official dissolution of armed factions and the military of defense recent appointments, the core issue remains largely unaddressed, which is the macro level motivations that drive individuals fighters. Now, in my research, the transformation or the shift from being a fighter to being a nation builder or a soldier needs more of a micro or more of a dissecting these different motivations. For example, we see that the motivations are totally kind of diverse and sporadic. For example, the first corps in the SNA, more of loyalty and tribal solidarity, is kind of more driven by loyalty and tribal solidarity. You see the second corps more of based on material incentives. The third corps is more ideological and emotional motivations. Now, why do we need to understand these micro level motivations is because most of my in-depth interviews with leaders of SNA factions actually reveal deep-seated challenges. First of all, fear of, so even if they got the appointments in top rank in the Ministry of Defense or in the new organizational structure of the Syrian army, they are still scared of accountability for wartime violations. Many faction leaders express apprehension regarding potential legal repercussions for human rights violations committed during the conflict. This fear actually underscores the urgent need for the new administration to establish a credible framework for transitional justice, balancing the demands for accountability with the necessity of reconciliation to prevent renewed violence. I'm talking about certain factions becoming spoilers. Now, the second concern, which is political marginalization. The third one is the need for institutional trust building. So in times when the Ministry of Defense take all the mission to rebuild or unify the national army, I think they are missing a very important point, which is the effort to build the trust and to promote genuine military integration. And some of the recommendations came to me is that they proposed the establishment Majlis Askari Thawri, which is a revolutionary military council, which would consist of 8 to 12 revolutionary military leaders, which would represent components of Syria's military landscape, including representatives from the Druze factions, commanders from southern factions, Ahmed Oudeh, and also leaders from Syrian Democratic Forces and key figures from SNA, and representatives of former Syrian regime's officers from those who did not commit any kind of or violated the human committed atrocities during the war. Now, of course, as I've briefed, as you know, and as Dima said, mentioned briefly, that the national dialogue excluded SDF, and I personally would have wished for the national dialogue or even the announcement of the reintegration of these armed groups to wait until the negotiations with SDF is kind of completed. Now, as you know, there is persistent resistance in the south. The situation is equally complex. The southern factions, particularly in Daraa and Suwaida, have shown little interest in integrating into the new national military. Now, and also in Suwaida, for example, there is also complexity and factionalism among Suwaida armed factions. Now,
yeah, Rahaf, if you could, 1 minute.
Yeah, I will get in 2 minutes. Now, I want also, lastly, I want to highlight the internal challenges and the lack of transparency in reconciliation and how this is affecting the military and security landscape. Now, there is lack of transparency in terms of how the reconciliations or التسويات والمصالحات is made, like the transitional justice. For example, there is Fadi Sakur who visited at Tadamun, which like his appearance and like he has reconciled with the new leadership implicated this fueled public anger. Victims' families and human rights groups have demanded clarity on the criteria used for these appointments, warning that the absence of transparent transitional justice framework could destabilize the fragile political order. Lastly, I want to also mention that the reconciliation with ex-regime criminals remains one of the most contentious issues. Adding to the complexity, interviews with former regime officers, including generals and brigaders, have revealed a mix of cautious optimism and palpable uncertainty. While these officers describe the process of disarmament and status settlements as relatively smooth, their demeanor suggested unease about their future roles. Many appeared uncertain about whether they would be integrated into the restructured army or sidelined entirely, leaving them in a state of limbo, which could destabilize the transition. Hundreds of thousands of state's employees were also expelled and ousted with no clear process. So there is a need for a transitional justice council under international supervision that could offer a path forward by balancing accountability with reconciliation. And I'm happy, I don't want to take from Joshua's time, but I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Rahaf. Appreciate it. Our fourth participant or speaker today, Joshua Landis, as introduced him earlier. He is also the director of the Farzani Family Center for Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies at the Boren College of International Studies, University of Oklahoma. And he will be helping us trying to decipher U.S. policies. Trump Kovadis, where are you on this on this issue, and particularly with all the talk in Washington by the administration about different issues in the region? We haven't heard much about Syria. Professor Landis, the microphone is yours. Microphone.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you very much, Khalil, for inviting me, and thank you to my colleagues for laying the groundwork here so nicely. I'd like to talk about 5 things in this, and one is banks getting paid, government institutions, electricity, and finally security. But let me start with sanctions. You know, everyone has insisted how important it is to have sanctions lifted. And that's one thing I think we didn't really appreciate is how devastating sanctions have been on Syria. And I think that they played a major role in destroying the Assad regime and impoverishing it so that they began to raising the levels of both corruption and coercion within the Assad state. But ultimately, the army collapsed because sanctions had a very corrosive effect on Syria and have of course, impoverished Syria. And so it's extremely important to have sanctions lifted as quickly as possible. Otherwise, this new government is likely to fail. And if people want a stable and prospering Syria, those sanctions have to be withdrawn. And that's really the major debate that's going on at the Paris conference that's being held today in France. And it's the first time that the American administration is going to be represented and sort of lay out some kind of policy. So we'll find at the end of today what sort of policy America is going to hammer out. But it's quite clear that Qatar, Turkey, and the supporters of Syria and its new government are going to be asking for an immediate and very quick withdrawal of the sanctions. But many the Europeans have said that they want a step by step, and America looks like it will lead. It may pursue a step by step, which is very confusing because the central bank in Syria remains under sanctions. Tahrir al-Sham, even though it's disappeared, remains under sanctions. It's very unclear that international institutions will invest in Syria as long as sanctions, even partial sanctions, are hanging over the country. Okay, enough on sanctions, but it's quite clear that the government and Ahmed Shara have been focusing on getting sanctions lifted. That's why he has spent so much time gaining legitimacy, foreign legitimacy, going to Saudi Arabia, going to Turkey, trying to engage with Western leaders and speaking to Western journalists, spending so much time because he needs those sanctions lifted. But it leaves a lot of questions unanswered for Syrians. And he hasn't really laid out a timeline. And that's crucial. A timeline for things like banks. Why are the banks still closed? When will they be opened? I'll give you one little example. My brother-in-law, Latakia, has a small plastic factory. That's been closed for years because, of course, there's no electricity. You can't run a factory without electricity. And the currency has been terrible inflation. You can't plan ahead. You make a deal with somebody for a certain amount of money, and then you lose only months later because inflation has eaten away all your profits. So, and today he cannot get his money out of local banks. There is not enough Syrian currency. This has caused the exchange rate to go way down from 15,000 to $1 to 9,000 to $1, but people can't get currency out of the banks. And there's a rumor going around that Russia is sending lots of new currency to Syria, printed currency, because Syria doesn't have enough currency. But it's only a rumor. We don't know. And we don't know when the banks are going to get open. And people need to know because they can't, the economy is going to remain stalled until there is some security about money and whether banks will open and you can get access to your money. When will people get paid? For the last 3 months, people have not been paid. And, this has had a devastating effect on family members in Syria because not only are people not getting their salaries, but people on pensions aren't getting their pensions, and they don't know whether they're going to get them in the future or whether they're not going to get them in the future. And that's put extraordinary stress on many families. And of course, in the Alawite community on the coastal region, there's where they had been so privileged in the past with government positions in almost every ministry, not just in the military and the security, intelligence, but also in education, in foreign service, in almost every industry. And it's quite clear that the government is shutting down most of these institutions, getting rid of many of the old employees who are complicit with the Assad regime in order to favor their own employees and their own people who are dependent on them and who have been displaced, who have been pushed out of the country and so forth. It's quite natural that this would happen, but it leads to tremendous insecurity and nobody knows what the plan is. The government needs to set out a timeline and allow Syrians to know what their expectations are. The government has said that about 400,000 employees, government employees, are ghost employees who have not been going to their jobs. But many people have been getting fired from hospitals and the healthcare service and teaching who have been going to their jobs. And so it's unclear how this process is working out and what kind of a fine-tooth comb is being used to fire people. government institutions are closed. It's very hard to get the documents you need in order to get your money out of the bank, for example. When are the government institutions going to open? And electricity. Everybody has mentioned electricity because it's so key to so many things. In Damascus, you may be getting 3 or 4 hours a day, but in many of the coastal cities, it's down to 1 hour a day or half an hour a day. Syria today produces only 1,500 megawatts. That's 1/6 of what it produced in 2011. And in order to rebuild that, and just to get back to where it was, which was not enough, it's estimated to cost about $40 billion. And it's unclear how Syria is going to get that, what kind of aid, and when people can expect electricity to come back on, because factories can't start. People are sitting freezing at home, and going to school becomes very difficult because it's cold. So these sorts of timelines have to be established for these major government services. Finally, security. In places like Damascus, security is pretty good. On the coast, many people are very frightened because the transitional justice has been pretty rough, and there is no judiciary. People don't know quite what to expect. Alawites, in particular, who have been complicit with the regime, have government jobs, who served in the military, don't know whether they are going to be considered guilty and tried or whether they're not considered guilty. There's no list of names. So when troops go into towns looking for generals or colonels, it's unclear who they're going to target. And we've seen certain towns like Zorbi outside of Homs and others and near Hama that have been largely cleared out. Towns where 70%, like Zorbi, is 70% of the people have fled, and their houses have been damaged and so forth. So there's great insecurity. And much of it is just lawlessness, that there aren't enough soldiers and troops from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham to impose law. And many people are singing the praises of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham if there's enough troops in the region to keep security. But there are these other militias, as we were hearing from Rahaf, who haven't really submitted control to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and to this new Syrian army. And there are abuses that seem to be going on in the countryside. Although one has to say that the transition has been much more secure than one might have thought. And but all of those things are undermining the stability of the country today because poverty is so severe, and people are getting money from people abroad in order to put food on the table, but most Syrians don't have somebody abroad who's going to send them money. And that's the timeline that this government really has to set out on those 5 crucial things to let Syrians know what's going to happen in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joshua. Thank you to all 4 of you for your excellent presentations. We have received already a lot of questions from the audience. I would encourage those who haven't sent their questions yet. Again, be brief. Use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your page. Address your question to a specific participant would be helpful, and I'll be delighted to read your questions and direct them to the person you indicated. First one is from Ian Drummond. Will the inclusion that we talked about include Christians, Alawites, and other minorities? The real fear that exists of repression and even expulsion in some minority communities right now. It's addressed to all 4 of you. So whoever would like to begin, go ahead, please. In terms of the issue of inclusion, whether smaller groups like Christians, Alawites, and other minorities should or will be included.
If I may take that.
Yeah, go ahead, Dima.
Yeah, because I think it was written when I was talking. So, like I said, there has been a lot of focus from the caretaker government, from the new leadership, since the beginning to reach out to these groups, to religious leaders, to community leaders based on religion lines and sectarian lines. There has been outreach to various Christian patriarchs and heads of churches. A lot of meetings with them, also with the Druze community. Of course, there still remains, I think, some tensions, and all of us talked about them with the Druze community in Sueda, but there has been a lot of ongoing meetings with them, and also with some Alawite. Now, with the Alawite is a little different because as I understand it from one of my friends in the coastal area, that a lot of the big leaders, the religious leaders in the Alawite community, they actually left Syria over the last few decades because they actually were clashing with the Assad regime and the way they were using the Alawite community. But there has been attempts to reach some of the community leaders. And I know some of the issues that Joshua talked about with some of the issues going on in the coastal areas, they are working with community leaders there. And I think this is one of my issues that I pointed out, that there has been a lot of focus on inclusion of these communities, which is important, but we need to see inclusion of the political representatives and the civil society representatives that have been a major part of the last few years. But yes, so there is a lot of work actually, and I think most of the work has been on inclusion of those communities. And actually, and as much as I hate to talk about these things, you know, I should point out that the preparatory committee that was declared yesterday, one of the women, you know, there are 2 women in it out of the 7 people. Yeah, and one of them is she's from the Christian community.
Right.
Okay.
If I
Rahaf, sorry, go ahead, Joshua.
Sorry. If I could just jump in, you know, yes, there's been a lot of outreach to various communities, but there are many appointments that, of course, are quite frightening. If I can speak for Alawites, the new commissioner for education in Latakia Governorate was appointed, and almost immediately videos of him a year earlier giving speeches in which he calls Alawites nejas. He says that they're the enemies of God. He doesn't just say this about Alawites. He says about Jews and Christians as well. And so these sorts of appointments are rather frightening. The new police force in Humps, there was a video that circulated of the graduation ceremony in which the commandant for the new cadets was doing a call and response with the cadets at graduation ceremony, in which he asked, "What is our constitution? What is our constitution? Dasturina, dasturina." And the answer was El Quran. What is our way? Sabilina, sabilina. The answer is jihad. And now it's quite understandable. This government has been put together very quickly, and many of the lieutenants of Ahmed Shara came from extremely Salafist backgrounds, so it makes sense that they would continue the sorts of drills they had been brought up on in this new police force. But it shows how improvised everything is, and those sorts of videos, of course, terrify people from minority groups who feel like they're going to be discriminated against. And well, at any rate,
yeah, Rahaf, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, I think I want just to add, like, I do agree with the points mentioned here, but like, also a few months ago, I did publish a report on Alawites and the dissonance, and I think Syrians need, and even the new leadership needs to understand that there is shifting in loyalties among the Alawites, and what has been mentioned by Dima, that there is a difficulty really, and the regime has not only used or co-opted or instrumentalized Alawites into making them fight for or kill for Assad, but also they have even kind of destroyed any communal initiatives. So Alawites don't have any wajahat or community leaders, as mentioned. And there is now initiatives to create this kind of community leadership for Alawites to be represented. But let's go beyond these kind of requirements for the new leadership. And I think we need the new leadership has been really kind of amazingly in terms of rhetoric in including the minorities. I mean, if we study in terms of discourse how the new leadership or إدارة العمليات, the theaters of aggression when it started, the way that they addressed minorities was kind of very inclusive in terms of rhetoric. However, even we need to think about these appointments that goes beyond the sectarian lines or beyond the minority kind of inclusivity, and thinks about like whether these appointments are based on loyalty, even if there's Christians among them, even if there was Jews among them. So we need to know whether it's based on loyalty or based on really kafa'at or kind of the professional.
Qualifications, yeah. Brahim, there is a question directed to you from Connie Hammond about the Kurdish. You referred to the Kurdish issue. She would like to know a little bit more about Kurdish demands in Syria. What is at issue here?
Well, I could talk about it in policy terms or in more general and national terms. If in the more general and national terms, they are like any other group. They want to have to live in security, to have dignity, and be able to celebrate their culture. But also there are more complexity to that when it comes to when we talk about the details of how much autonomy or decentralization the region in the northeast should have. We hear a lot sometimes in Western circles about Kurdish independence. I think most Syrians, whether they are Arabs or Kurds, know that that project is not viable. Geopolitically, politically, economically, so many reasons, such a state cannot live. It doesn't have a prospect. However, I think one of the concerns is to actually rely on Turkey to solve this issue with force. So far, we've heard from Damascus that they're asking Turkey to give them time and space to find a way out with negotiations with the Kurds, but I still think there is a lack of trust between both sides, and there is still no clear plan giving exactly what also Brahim was talking about in the armed or the new army structure. So there isn't that trust yet, and there isn't a clear plan moving forward with that. I've also seen another question for me on Israel.
Mm-hmm.
The issue of Israel is not very present in the Syrian discussion, the day-to-day one. One of the reasons is all the priorities that Dima, Rahaf, and Joshua were talking about. Syrians, everything is urgent in Syria, and the priorities are massive today. And no electricity, no connectivity, no heat, no money. So, and the issue of Israel, people don't feel it affect their day-to-day life because they took further part of Syria, but they are not trying to be part or change the intradynamics inside Syria. They didn't even try during the war 2011-2024. So many people feel that that's not a priority. However, of course, I do think that there is a prospect in the future to work on that. Even during Hafez al-Assad time, the mantra was Salam al-Adil wal-Shamil, the just and comprehensive peace. So most Syrians, while they sympathize deeply with Palestinians, and there is a natural connection between Syrians and Palestinians, let alone the considerable Palestinian-Syrian community inside Syria, but Syrians don't want to or don't have the vision of annihilating Israel or going something extreme. I think most Syrians believe at some point there will be negotiations. Syrians do believe the Golan Heights is Syria and should be back to Syria, but I do believe that one day there will be negotiations. However, it's very too early, and I would actually warn any authority in Damascus to reach any such agreements about the sovereignty in Syria at this point. First, it's too weak, and that agreement won't last because it's made at a time that it's not, there is no balance between both powers. And second, it doesn't have the legitimacy or the mandate to do that.
Let me ask you the other side of the coin related to this question. I mean, we all know, and you just implied that since the collapse of the regime, the Assad regime, Israel has taken advantage clearly of the vacuum created in the country by seizing Syrian territory, by fortifying its presence inside Syria's borders, by building even new military outposts in the country. And it is also interfering and playing games ethnically in the areas it controls, trying to now all of a sudden push the issue of Israeli citizenship in the Golan more aggressively than in the past. But aside from the political and regional implication, which you answered adequately, what is the impact of this Israeli intrusion on Syrian policies of kind of getting their act together on the political recovery of Syria? Is this intervention by a powerful neighbor impacting the ability of Syria to recover?
I think it's been seen very clearly that it's an aggressive step. However, I haven't seen a clear impact on intra-dynamics among Syrians themselves. And probably that also, you know, there is a fatigue among Syrians, generally speaking. And that has, of course, again, to the issue of prioritizing, but also you feel there is a general posture by Syrians that they do not want to go into another war. Not internally, not regionally, not even, you know, when you talk about Iran and Russia, from those on the opposition. Actually, that the authority was open to Russia. It was received in a positive way, that it shows political maturity. People are not being demanding any certain policies towards Iran, and that applies also in Israel. People, again, I haven't seen any Syrian who doubts if the Golan Heights is Syrian or not. However, also all Syrians know that if you actually have a referendum today in the Golan Heights, probably they don't want to go back to a country that we don't know its future yet. Not because, and Khalil, you mentioned a very important point that over the last few years, we see in the younger generation, there is more acceptance of Israeli citizenship. It's been promoted to them. However, there is also the older generations are very proud Syrians, and they haven't accepted the citizenship. I think this issue is a long-term issue. I hope the Israelis will stop here and won't try to intervene in any dynamics inside Syria. And I hope other players in the region also step up and focus on what we're talking about, the Syrian sovereignty. If Israel at some point steps further and undermine the Syrian sovereignty, also the consequences will be bad, not only for Syrians, but for Israel as well.
If I could add one.
Joshua, the question was also directed at you. So if you don't mind, particularly with regards to the change that just Brahim referred to a little bit about, according to John Anderson, who asked the question, some 50% of the Druze-affiliated population, or Druze, not affiliated, the Druze population of the Golan Heights have actually accepted Israeli citizenship thus far. What if that number is correct or not? So is there like first of all, anything being done by the current government, or is it still too early? But the challenge, as Brahim just said,
well, I think it's important.
Is there for the future? Yeah, go ahead.
I think that the importance of Israel taking more territory is that it's going to affect American policy, and I think that's the most important thing. It is that the United States is going to become an enemy of this regime, the Syrian regime. It's almost inevitable because the U.S. is so closely allied with Israel that there's going to be a conflict over this new conquest. If it's not today, because the country has got other concerns, it's going to be tomorrow. And that's going to force the United States to side with Israel against Syria. And it's going to get caught in the same dynamic that Syria has been caught in all along geostrategically. And I just will remind you of one little historical fact, which is that Shukr al-Quwatli, the president of Syria at independence, wanted America to come and rebuild his army, which was full of minorities. And he was frightened of his army. He tried to dissolve it. This first minister tried to dissolve the army so he could rebuild it with people loyal to him. And he wanted America to help him do it and get him arms and strengthen the army. America was trying to do this. And then in 1947, Secretary of State Marshall wrote a letter to the legation in Syria and said, we cannot do it because Congress will never approve it because there's going to be war in Palestine. And the European powers and America put a ban on selling weapons to Syria. And at that moment, Syria began to talk about going to Russia. It took a few years because Syria was frightened of what Britain and America might do if they went to Russia, but they had to go to Russia, which is why I think that Sharat will have to go to Russia again in the future, because where is he going to get arms? How is he going to build up a new army? He can go to Turkey, but he doesn't want to be totally reliant on Turkey. He's going to have to go back to Russia because America is not going to sell him arms, and neither is Europe. And China does not like him because he's put Uyghurs in a lot of positions. And just yesterday, he said that all the Uyghur children could go to school and are going to get nationality in Syria. So China is very upset with him. That means he's going to have to go to Russia. And America is going to increasingly become an enemy again of the Syrian regime. Maybe not an enemy, but it's going to take Israel's concerns. And Syria is going to have to ask Israel to withdraw from these new territories. And we see that Israel's already building big bases. So that dynamic, it's not inevitable, but there's a probability that it's going to start again because of occupied territory.
Yeah. Thank you, Joshua. Before I go to Dima, I just want to add a bit more complexity to what you just described, Joshua, is the fact that the U.S. does recognize basically Israel's annexation of the Golan. The question is this recognition by automatically kind of extended to the kind of growing annexation, if you will?
Well, the U.S. hasn't complained yet.
It hasn't. It hasn't complained at all. Dima.
Yeah, I just want to add to this point, actually three points. In terms of acceptance among the young people, actually from my observation and attending many events around Damascus, actually, no, the level of acceptance of Israel or any normalization therewith is actually pretty low. And I think this is mostly, I think people were apathetic for a long time, possibly, but over the last year since the Gaza war started, this has revived again the anti-Israel sentiment among the young people. So I wouldn't go as far as saying, you know, they don't care anymore, or there is a high level of acceptance. The second point is regarding the Druze. The percentage, 50% is not about the Golan Druze. I think that number might be about Druze overall in Palestine. So it includes the Druze in other areas. And I don't want to go too much into detail, but there has been, within the community itself, there has been rejection of getting the citizenship, or else you are ejected from the community and you lose your rights to certain lands of the family. And this is, I think there are studies about this. So I don't think that number 50% is not about the Golan Druze. The third point is about why Israel is doing this, and what's, you know, this can be a bargaining chip. I think it's one of the things that will be used. We will see attempts to use it in terms of specifically with the lifting of U.S. sanctions, because we know from studies of U.S. sanctions, I have to go back and see, I don't think the U.S. has lifted sanctions off of any country that it has imposed sanctions on. And today, until today, we know in the Iraq model, the money from the oil actually goes to the Federal Reserve and then it's given back to Iraq. So they will try to use this as a bargaining chip, and that I think that follows from, I don't remember who talked about it, that I think both Joshua and Ibrahim talked about this. And we do expect that to be used as a precondition on easing some of the sanctions, not even lifting the sanctions, which will mean that probably we'll see what Joshua said is turning east and to other alternatives in terms of trying to evade the sanctions, particularly in the military sector.
Yeah. No, I also fully agree with you that the 50% number that was suggested might be too high for the Druze in the Golan. The question of the 48 Druze inside Israel, as you know, the whole community is subject to an agreement way back to the early 50s, where they all served in the armed forces and so on. Of course, they have the right to refuse to do so. And of course, they face legal charges and they go to jail for that. And some of them do. But it's a totally different ballgame between the Druze community inside Israel and the Druze community in the Golan, particularly recent changes, as one of you just pointed. There is a generational aspect to it. So when you talk about the generation of Druze in the Golan that have grown up knowing nothing but Israel, they don't know Syria. They've never lived under Syria. So there is a bifurcation there, generational. The old, having visited the Golan and talked with a lot of people on the Golan in the past, I would say what existed immediately after 67 is still existing, although the ratios have changed, the emotions have changed with time, but the sentiment is probably still there. Are there anything being done by the government right now to rein in the attacks or negative steps being taken against some minority groups other than rhetoric? That's a question from Bakar Muhammad. Are there any practical things being done to avoid that at this time? Anybody?
I think I can come to that just generally speaking.
Yeah.
No, I haven't. I think what we can, I think, conclude with like 3 points. Like transparency, we still are lacking that kind of transparent channel between the new leadership and the people on the ground, and still all of this is rhetoric in terms of that saying like it's an individual kind of committed atrocity. It's not meant to be by representative of the new leadership, but like still we haven't seen that kind of building or establishing a transitional committee or of how what is the transitional justice will be, or who is gonna be kind of targeted in this transitional kind of committee. So I don't think we have seen any kind of practical steps towards improving or challenging these kind of incidents. I think also trust as well, building trust, and this is a part of how that can be. Building trust between the new leadership and the people through still we haven't seen the Syrian national TV is still closed. We are, as Syrians, we follow the news from Telegram and on social media. We don't have like an official channel. And the third one is, I think, so transparency, trust, and also I think what's really important is communication. And as I've mentioned, we haven't seen kind of clear communications or between the leadership and the people.
Is to me, at least as an observer from the outside, it seems like communication has been a problem. I mean, who speaks for this new government? Most of the issues and complaints that are emerging seem to come from marginal figures in the government rather than from the official leader or the official spokesman.
One source told me that, and it's on social media.
Yeah, is this really happening? And I mean, am I assuming that there is a little bit of chaos in terms of the messenger or the message?
No, this is a real problem. This is a formidable problem. This is an issue.
Okay.
It is. And Ahmed Shara has not spoken about the Alawites. He's spoken about the Christians at some length,
right,
and having people from all sectors of Syria being represented and so forth. But we just saw on this latest, organizing committee for the national dialogue, yes, 2 women were placed in there, and one is a well-known Christian woman, but the rest were from various Islamist streams, and there's no Alawite, there's no Kurd, there's no, this, it still looks very much like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And that's been a recurring, everybody notices it, everybody's remarks on it. And he hasn't addressed the Alawite community in any way. And this either to reassure them or to say that they're going to be punished or how they're going to be punished. There's no clear line on where does punishment end and inclusion begin. And that has many people frightened. And, just this weekend in Latakia, posters went up around town with various fatwas from Ibn Taymiyyah, which scared people a lot because Ibn Taymiyyah, as everybody knows, is the medieval faqih who said that Alawites were demahun wa malahun halal and so forth, that their money and that their blood was legitimate. These sorts of things send fear through the community, and they're waiting to hear their new president, who many of them saw that Assad had just driven the country into complete bankruptcy and into a dead end. And many of them are very hopeful that Ahmed Shara is going to turn this around and that Syria will be a much better country in the future. But they haven't heard anything from him personally
directly
about their future.
Thank you for that. And on this note, unfortunately, our time is up. I would like to thank Dima, Brahim, Rahaf, and Joshua for their excellent presentations and for taking all these questions. My apologies to many in the audience who have sent questions. We have tens of questions that we haven't been able to accommodate. So clearly, we have to do this again. I think this issue has raised so many questions so far that haven't been answered. And again, thank you for joining us today. And please stay tuned to additional webinars on Syria and on other topics pertaining to the Middle East and to U.S. policy and interest